Welcome to Everything Change, Croeso I NEWID Popeth, 10 days of talks, conversations, readings and performances about creativity and adaptive thinking in response to the climate and ecological crises. When it comes to drastically reducing emissions of greenhouse gases and protecting biodiversity, we largely know and have known for a long time what we have to do. The challenge facing us now, therefore, is perhaps more one of the imagination than of action. How might we, as individuals, nations, as species, imagine a different way of being on this planet? How might we imagine a fairer, healthier future for ourselves, our children, and the natural world upon which we rely to survive? How might creativity across the arts, sciences, business, law, policy, activism, education help make that future feel not just vital, but possible? These are some of the questions that we'll be exploring in Everything Change, through artistic provocations, events with two of the world's leading writers, and 7 interdisciplinary conversations across 7 crucial areas of change: money, food, water, energy, justice, story, and change itself.
What is the future for transformational change? How might we be more creative about the ways in which we campaign and protest, both from within and outside our systems of government? The climate and ecological crises are symbiotic and systemic challenges, so is single-issue activism a thing of the past? Thank you for joining us for our final panel discussion, chaired by co-founder of the UK Disability Arts Alliance, Andrew Miller, in which we'll be exploring the drivers, methods and conditions for changing change.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Andrew Miller. I'm a cultural consultant, disability champion and broadcaster in the UK. And I'm delighted to be chair of this penultimate Everything Change panel session. Welcome. Self-description: I'm a middle-aged white man with brown hair and glasses sitting in front of an orange blind. In a few moments, I will introduce you to our panel and the area of change that we will be discussing today, change itself. But first, here is a pre-recorded provocation from Tasmanian and Aboriginal artist and curator Dave Gough, who's going to share his personal approach for cultural and environmental change.
I'm coming to you today from an ancient tea tree forest, a really important environment for our people and for everything that lives in it. For thousands and thousands of years, I've used the tea tree forest as a place to gather our resources, our foods, to harvest the materials to make our fire sticks from these barks, to shave down and precision make our spears for hunting, and also to use these timbers to build our huts for our villages. These reeds to strip and weave into baskets. There's a huge amount of food resources in this area, from the birds and their eggs to even the plants and all the animals that come through this forest. So from gathering our food through here for thousands and thousands of years, this forest has gone through some really dramatic changes recently, and in what some people call progress. But we definitely do not call this progress. People come to get their food here today. In what wrong way? Go back. Hi, I'm now inside Tiagara, the Cultural Centre. This is where we teach education. This place was built in 1976 and it has had a huge history. It hasn't had a great history. It's been in and out of tourism, education. It's been in the wrong hands, the right hands. So it's a huge journey. Look, our family leased it off the local council on a 20-year lease, and it was a really difficult, overpowering, complex lease. And it led to us getting breached of our lease. So our cultural centre, after being in here for 20 years, we got breached. We had to hand the keys over and walk away. That really upset us as a community and as a family, because it's a place that we love and hold dear. Just the lease agreements was not fair or just on us. So in 2015, I was asked to come to TAFE, a secondary education institution, and to come and talk to them about constitutional change in Aboriginal reforms and things like that in state and federal legislation. Oh, wow, big topic. So, but that quickly led to this TAFE students and teachers asking about Tiagara. What's happening to Tiagara? Why isn't it open? Why did you have to give the keys back? All these questions. So then that led to them getting a clearer understanding. So through educating them, they got to understand what the real story was, rather than reading it in the newspaper, which was not really great stories that were being told at the time about us and this place. So they wanted to do a march and a protest, which I had to quickly sort of look at that and say, well, that just forces. And I don't like to be forceful, and generally forcefulness makes people turn away. So we quickly sort of, went through conversations, and that led to us formulating Come Walk With Us. And they contacted state, federal politicians, local councillors and schools and local communities, put out flyers, come walk with us, and find out what's happening with Tigara. So the big walk that day was hundreds of people walking up to our cultural centre. They got greeted by us doing a welcome ceremony and a dance and singing and foods and cultural presentations, and then talked about what's happened here and why we want the place back. That quickly led to us getting the keys back, and started a 2-year process of eventually getting title of these 2 buildings, self-determination. And then from that, it's been trying to get funding, and we have managed to get some funding. We're doing upgrades finally after 40-something years of not being able to really do anything here. So it's really positive. So education and informing people and building relationships got us through that protesting stage to get us our cultural centre back. And now we focus really on education, bringing school groups through here and teaching about our old culture, our history and our heritage, and the importance of caring for country, and how to identify our culture in the landscapes, and then being able to, that they become, the students become the teachers. But then, during this time, we've had, I've had students that are the children of ministers, our political ministers' children coming through here. So I've had Minister of Climate Change, Education and Aboriginal Affairs. So that relationship's been building, and there has been some positive outcomes through that as well. So I hope to build on that, and that's really, really important. So education, change a generation. One of these little kids will one day, or could one day, be a future leader. They can also go home and tell their parents that they're really off track and they need to change their ways. So we need to support the young ones, support the children. They are not as corrupted by the businesses and the corporate world as we all are. They can see things more clearly and more logically. So support the children. It's really important. Education can make a change. Use our arts and our culture and our works in art, as I try to do in large outdoor performances and installations, to put subliminal messages and get have many layers to our work, so that people can sort of later on think, oh, wow, that actually meant this, or it actually can make change. Get ourselves into the media and do things in a positive way, and try to infiltrate and get our key messages out through as many mediums as we can as artists. So through the pandemic here, we went through a lot of changes, obviously. We went into lockdown, as everyone has, and during lockdown, we watched the environment become healthy again quite quickly. And now coming out, the mad rush to get back to the terrible normal of destruction and supporting corporate, the corporate sector on really failed and flawed industries that are detrimental to our environment. So it's very disappointing to see that this quick rush to get back when we had time to contemplate and look at new ways. We also went from international people to national people, down to regional people, down to community people. And that was really interesting. I really enjoyed the fact that we got to speak to our neighbours more and look around our own environments, and focus on, looking on what's going on around us. So, I hope that that can make some changes. We can actually look more closely around us and look at us as people and communities and villages, just like our old people did for thousands of years.
Our thanks to Dave for sending that film over to us, illustrating the importance of education, time and continuity, as well as how vital it is for us not to waste that time or our historic experiences. So across the next 50 minutes, our panel are going to answer and offer insight to a series of questions. What's the future of transformational change? How might we be more creative about the ways in which we campaign and protest, both from within and outside our systems of government? How do we measure the true impact of our actions? What part can education play in sowing the seeds for rapid and ingrained cultural change? Is single issue activism a thing of the past? And what can we learn from our pasts to inform our futures? And perhaps most importantly, what over the last year of the pandemic have we learned about change? So it's time to meet the panel who are going to offer their insight into these issues. And I hope they will magically appear as I introduce them. Sophie Howe is the world's only Future Generations Commissioner, with a remit set out in law to be the guardian of the interests of future generations in Wales. Since taking up the post in 2016, Sophie's been described by The Big Issue as one of the UK's leading change makers, and she will consider how working better in partnership will help us to achieve change. Griffiths is an award-winning Wales-based writer whose work has explored how time is a political subject, the importance of wildness and the influence of Indigenous cultures. Jay will consider how the ecological and climate crisis is spoken about and the unique position that our dominant culture is in. Dr. Mya-Rose Craig is a British Bangladeshi birder, conservationist and environmentalist. She writes a blog, BirdGirl, and highlights global climate justice as it intersects with climate change action. Mya-Rose has been making significant impact since the age of 13 when she founded Black to Nature, which campaigns for equal access to nature for all, but concentrating on visible minority ethnic communities, and will share her experience of that work. And finally, Samia Zaman works in film and television in Bangladesh as a creator, organizer, and manager. She founded the International Film Initiative of Bangladesh, worked for the BBC World Service, and is the CEO and editor of Ekator Television, a 24-hour news channel. Samia will consider how media influences our behavioural choices. Each panellist will offer opening remarks of up to 5 minutes each. I will reluctantly interrupt if the speakers go over that. And then we'll have an open discussion between us and also address any questions you wish to offer in the chat function. Please do send your questions through as we go. I'll do my best to get through all of them. But first up, let's hear from Griffiths.
Hello, thank you so much for those introductions, and what an interesting, insightful film that was from Dave Gough. What I want to start off talking about is the unique position that the dominant culture is in, because although many civilizations before this one has been able to see and in a way predict their own downfall, notably indigenous cultures which have been invaded, no civilization before the dominant cultures has been able both to accurately predict its own downfall and be able to prevent its destruction, and yet fails to do so. So looking at, I'm going to just start with that pointer and then look at how we speak and how I think that's affected it. With the climate emergency, that the first communications about it came appropriately from scientists, and they spoke in a way that was entirely right and appropriate for the domain of science. It was cool, it was measured, it was impersonal and dispassionate. The point of how that information was then communicated, this is when it seems to me that it fell drastically awry, is that the information that they were giving us, the public, everyone, should have been passed on as terrified mammals would have passed it on. It's like any self-respecting meerkat would have responded to that information with fear, with terror, with passion. And yet somehow how the information was passed on through the media was, again, cool, dispassionate studies. It bored people senseless, frankly. What was needed was the exact reverse. It was to be, to be personal, to be real about this. Then the kinds of communications that went so badly wrong, governments have a legal duty as well as an ethical one, to properly inform their citizens. They didn't do it. The media has a moral and professional obligation to properly inform. Largely, that hasn't happened. Also, in education, I understand that the kind of, as Dave's film pointed out, is like, you educate young people because they're less influenced by the corporate and the kind of, in a sense, the established powers. But it's also, education is for all of us. It's for adults of all ages. And I just want to close by saying that, as somebody once said, that one of the best ways to change communicatively is not by speaking better, it's by speaking differently. I think that's a really important kind of nub to hold on to. And I think this is where protests like the ones organised by Extinction Rebellion have done this. They've created a way in which people have started to speak passionately, personally, devotedly, and in a sense, absolutely authentically. And I'd like to point out that that from the end of this week, there will be Extinction protesters in court, including Jessica Townsend, Rupert Reed, one of the co-founders, and Claire Farrell. They are in court because they created an event speaking about climate denialists. They created the event right outside the Global Warming Policy Foundation, which has been a major source of climate denial. And they are the ones in court because they spoke the truth. And the people who should be in court for their lies, and the lies that will do so much damage around the world, so much hideous destruction, are the ones who are not in court, the climate denialists. And so that seems like a very key kind of way of saying how we speak is so crucial. It's so important that it's actually, ended up with the truth tellers in court. Thank you.
Jay, thank you very much. And we've already got some subjects to discuss and some questions in the chat, which we'll move on to after we've heard from everyone. I'd now like to ask Mya-Rose to speak to us now. Thank you.
Yeah, so I'm 19 and I've been involved in, again, the climate change movement for essentially all of my teenage years. I started when I was 12 or 13, and there wasn't any reason for that except a sense of the real dire urgency, really, that Jay's talking about, where it felt like there was no choice to get involved. But something I found really interesting over the period that I've been involved in activism is the different ways that people have gone about engaging people to these issues and getting them to get out onto the streets and protest. Because one of the things that I find fascinating about climate change is that these days there is a massive percentage of people in the UK, well over half, who say they are very, very concerned about climate change. That number drastically drops when people are asked if they're willing to change their lifestyles to counter climate change. But I think really what we need to take away from that isn't really that people need to change their lifestyles, is that we need to be pushing for systemic and global change. And I think really getting people out onto the streets is sort of dual issue, where it's all about education and empowerment. I think in general, especially for young people, which I've been very involved in the youth movements, but in general, it's always being pushed that unless you're literally going out and voting, people don't really have a voice on, I suppose, the day-to-day issues that our government's talking about. And then suddenly I remember the Youth Strikes for Climate and again Extinction Rebellion popped up out of nowhere, and for a lot of people that was extremely exciting. And the reason it was because they were empowering people to get out onto the streets. They were creating a framework and letting people express their concern and their anger about these issues. And I think there's so many different ways to push for transformative change. I actually read the book This Is an Uprising that Extinction Rebellion based all of their different actions on. It's fascinating. I would absolutely recommend. But ironically, I genuinely think that returning to some of the more old traditional types of protest would absolutely help in creating new and brand new change, basically. So books like Gene Sharp's 198 Methods of Nonviolent Action were written decades ago, but are still totally relevant and being used today. And I think when we're trying to create movements now, it's so important to remember that some of the biggest, most effective people's movements happened decades ago, like in the 30s with the Labour movement. But I also think nowadays the importance of the internet and the ways to utilize it are totally being underestimated. There is so much potential to engage people with movements, to again empower them to get out onto the streets, that I don't think people have even thought about, let alone explored yet. we saw that even on a very basic level with Fridays for Future, where just via WhatsApp chats, hundreds of thousands of teenagers and children across Europe went out to protest about climate change. And that was just one way of spreading the word. And I do actually think, I just want to mention quickly that I think unlike the left, the right is thriving online. It has totally mastered engaging with and radicalizing people, while we're left, well, the left is left, debating and having discourse and not really doing that at all. But I suppose what I'm trying to say quickly is that I think the root of all transformative change is people power. And I think the narrative that always is pushed, like I said before, is that we don't have a voice. And that I think it's important to remember that that is extremely purposeful from our leaders, from our governments, and that we have to push past that. And I just want to end with, when Extinction Rebellion first came out onto the streets, their main slogan was "Tell the Truth." And since that, climate change has become a mainstream central issue in politics. And that was only 3 years ago. And I think it's really important to look back at the victories that we've had and recognise how much could change going forwards if we just try.
Mya-Rose, thank you very much. Really interesting perspectives, and particularly then thinking as how protest has changed and how that's developing as well. That's something we can go on to talk about. Sophie, I'd like to come to you now and have your opening remarks. Thank you.
So I think, we need to stop thinking about change as a kind of, a static thing, a one policy win, or or one campaign to achieve one thing. And, in lots of ways that, you can see why that happens. Messages become simpler, but that's actually the problem with our whole system. Nothing in our system is simple, and everything is connected to everything. So when we start only focusing in one area, we're often missing the kind of interconnections, either positively or the way in which we could do things in a different and better way to promote positive benefits across a range of different issues, or worse, we're actually, might be fixing a problem in one area and causing a problem in another. So I think that, there's certainly something around that more holistic thinking, because, if we think about how, and this is why I think, what Mya-Rose is doing in terms of focusing on Black, Asian, minority ethnic communities and their engagement with nature, environmental activism and so on is so important, and that because environmental justice is a racial justice issue, why is it that our actions here in wealthier countries are in the main impacting on people of colour in the global south? Why is it that even in this country, if you're from a Black community, you're more likely to be living in areas of high air pollution, you're less likely to have access to nature or be engaged in in nature type organisations and so on. So, when we think about those kind of connections, they don't very often feature in some of the campaigns or the kind of policies that we see taken forward by government. So I think it's, really focusing on that kind of holistic nature. How do we start bringing people together and start having conversations? My job is, to advise public bodies in Wales, including the government, on how they can meet 7 national wellbeing goals set out in our Wellbeing of Future Generations Act. And just a moment on that. So we're the only country in the world to have legislated to try to protect the interests of future generations. We're the only country in the world to have set out 7 long-term interconnected goals, which our 44 institutions covered by the Act are required to meet. So here we are trying to change the system itself. I think in the main, however, mostly approaches are trying to deal with the effects of a system rather than trying to change the kind of corrosive value system itself. And, that's where we have this huge challenge in Wales, because we're not just trying to change the habit of kind of one lifetime, we're trying to change the habits of very many lifetimes, which is I work in my department, I do my stuff in my department, protecting my budget, and I've got to do it before the next election, because that's what my political masters are telling me I need to do. And we need to get absolutely beyond that. But we also have to recognise that everything that is within our current system at the moment is stopping us moving in that direction. Even though we have a law here in Wales which requires us to do that, if I asked the health sector, what is it, health, then, that you're doing about the 8.3% of deaths in the UK which are caused, or a significant contributing factor being air pollution, they will tell you that that's not their business. They will tell you that they're not funded to do that. They will tell you that when the chief executive of the NHS pulls them in, she or he is not asking questions about what they're doing about air pollution. They're asking questions about how they're treating people. So we are effectively, our whole system is geared up to do single short-term things, which are usually based on sticking plasters. And then I think back to, what both Jay and Mya-Rose has said in terms of, so how do we change that? I think it is about bringing people together. In my last job, which was in policing, we brought a mental health senior nurse into my team because we were talking about offenders. She was talking about patients. The person in the middle was not getting the service from either organisation that they needed. We also need to be making sure that those conversations are happening. And I think one of the the best ways, or I say it's the simplest ways. Nothing is ever simple, but one of the simplest ways of shaking up the system is mass job swap across. Why don't we have creatives in residence in our public services? Imagine the sorts of different types of solutions you would get there. I think someone mentioned taking the conservationist, into the social services department or into the health department. How would that shake up that system? We also need that challenge through activism. We need evidence through scientists. We need campaigns which build excitement. We need people who can talk a language to politicians. And Jay's point was absolutely spot on in terms of that, the evidence-based not translating into action for politicians. And there are, there's some stat out there about the thousands and thousands of academic papers that are out there telling us things we need to know, which are never written. So it needs to be a collection of solutions for us to drive change, which isn't just affecting or isn't just changing the effects of the system, but is changing the system itself.
Great, thank you very much, Sophie. And finally, we go to Bangladesh and Samia.
Thank you very much. Actually, the discussion or the presentations already are so interesting that I'm kind of like getting drawn into those and want to engage with that. But from my point of view, because my main experience throughout my working life is through media in its various form, television, film, and radio in a little bit of a distant past, but it's there. It has all come back as podcast, of course. And what I have seen, if I'm talking about the recent past, post-COVID, is this explosion of media consumption. And in the various ways it is, creating its own different kind of ecosystem and how we are consuming it. And how, again, very big power, big moneyed power, big kind of West in that sense, that idea is controlling throughout the world. So Netflix, if I give an example, Bangladesh is a huge consumer of that, although it does not officially exist there. And some other transformative things have happened where media also played a very huge role. Like I will give the example of Black Lives Matter, where that video clip was so vital for shaking up all over the world. I incidentally happened to be in several different countries during the COVID era and saw and experienced some of those. Trump, we cannot forget Trump, how media was used by him, and how from Bangladesh or from the global south, we are kind of content in media that people from outside will come and film us, but we don't necessarily have a voice to show our story. So Netflix was that example, that how people in the South are trying to find similar stories. They're consuming K-dramas, they're consuming dramas from Turkey. They're trying to build kind of like a South-South collaboration to find stories that are told by kind of like us or them. All this is happening. And what Mya-Rose's point was that many of the many of the concerns, climate, environment, those kind of concerns often seem very far away to many people who are struggling in their daily life, and it seems kind of like something for idealist youths. So how to bridge that, and this not wanting to change your own lifestyle. It's not only a kind of like a rich nation problem, because although Bangladesh is at the forefront of being the victim of climate change, it will probably go underwater if the way things going. Even in Bangladesh, as a country, on a policy level and in a personal level, people are very, very reluctant to change the way things are doing. And there are some set criteria of development which media perpetuates, which gives this idea to people that this is the way to have a developed life. Our artist provocation was talking about that, although I have questions about that too. So given all that, media, if we accept it, that it is run by big money, big corporation, big interests, then again, during the recent past, this explosion of personal media, TikTok, China connection aside, the whole idea that you own your own airspace and you come up with things that you have thought is very interesting. And it's interesting how world over, the interests, government or big interests, are very wary and frightened of young people having their own voice and would do anything to actually shut it down. The beginning of it, actually, I saw it that when Occupation Wall Street was happening in New York, which is kind of like was a major point for many of the recent protests. Mainstream media basically chose to ignore it and refuse to cover them, and there are just so many protests and change-making events happening, which is relegated to some, obscure point of the media landscape. Mainstream neutral media or professional media equally problematic, because I was trained in the kind of BBC journalism, which gives same amount of time to some rabid right-wing position and with a position which is more progressive, because you have to give the same time. Again, this came up again, that how right-wing ideas or more extreme ideas have managed to manipulate and use available media, new media, in a much more effective way. That can be a whole new discussion, why left is left, and why debate and discussion will lead to actually longer and lengthy process, which can be frustrating, but it is absolutely essential. Because if we all then started to just follow dictates, which happened in left also, then this whole idea of discussion and finding the path through, this whole process is lost. And so
can I encourage you to wind up now, Samia?
That's it. I'm there, and I'm looking forward to the rest of the discussion. Samia, yes.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Some fascinating perspectives here. A lot around media and the politics of media, of course, but also education. And there was a really interesting question in the chat from Andrew Jones, which I think is one I'd really like to kick us off in this discussion, which is education being so important. How do we change the curriculum? Because it's so rooted in old ways of thinking. Mya-Rose, could I come to you on this, because you're perhaps off are the five of us the closest to the curriculum and having experienced it.
Yeah, totally. I mean, I finished school last summer, and I mean, quite frankly, I question whether or not that is even an option or a possibility, because the curriculum in the UK, at least, is totally dictated by politicians and the government, which obviously have a vested interest in not teaching and educating these kind of things. And what I think instead is that external education is really important. So I know like lots and lots and lots of young activists via various routes, and the common theme with all of them is that they have educated and taught themselves via resources online. And so even if there is not necessarily an option to be, you know, teaching or radicalizing children about these kind of things within the curriculum, which is rooted in these old ways of thinking that you're talking about, I think there are so many other possibilities. And yeah, it's kind of linked to the other question, really, where I think just in general, education is so important. But yeah.
Anybody else with views here? So, Sophie, would you like to come in on this?
Well, the good news is that we do have a new curriculum in Wales, which takes us closer to what I think is needed. So just the four purposes of the curriculum in Wales: ambitious and capable learners ready to learn throughout their lives, enterprising creative contributors ready to play their full part in life and work, ethical and informed citizens of Wales and the world, and so on. So, you know, we are getting closer to a sort of curriculum that I think, you know, all of us between us were sort of describing perhaps is needed to solve some of these big interconnected challenges of the future. Of course, the problem is, you know, and this is not just a problem in terms of the education system and whatever education policy might be coming from Wales, is it's really easy to write those things down in a strategy or a, you know, or a plan. Much more difficult is actually delivering those things when you have teachers in a system, and, you know, I'm not criticizing teachers particularly, but they've grown up in a system where they have been taught to impart knowledge in a siloed way, whether they're teaching history or science. They're imparting knowledge on those subjects to young people who are then going to be tested, and their life chances are going to be determined on whether they can regurgitate that knowledge in a 2-hour exam. So we can say all we like in the aspirations of a new curriculum, unless we, and this goes back to the points that I was making earlier around, you know, we can't just, you know, there's a challenge, isn't there, around sort of, you know, trying to eat an elephant, but, you know, if we're going to eat the elephant, we've got to have a plan for doing the whole thing. So we can't just say on paper we're going to change this curriculum and then not change the way that, and the expectations that we have on teachers, not change the examination system and so on. Some of the solutions around that, I think, are very similar to the sort of solutions that I was describing more generically. So why don't we have, you know, a national mission on education? So we bring in people from different walks of life. Why aren't we getting our ancestry.com buffs in teaching history, along with people from the local wildlife trust talking about the history and the heritage of land? You know, why aren't we bringing all of those different skills and experiences together so that the focus of our education system is to create these holistic citizens who are not just going to go on to another potentially extinct job, but actually to have a kind of life well lived and to be able to solve some of these, you know, be a key part in solving some of these big challenges that are facing us.
Jay.
Yes, what I'd like to say is that it seems to me so much of education, certainly in the UK, is about this idea of the core curriculum, the absolute essence of what people need to know. And the ambition of so much education in school is to train and encourage people to be absolutely right fits for paid employment when they leave. Now, it seems to me that what the system does is it absolutely meticulously misses the point. The first thing is, what is the core curriculum of being a human being? It's like, you know, it's to think, it's to have certain needs and to have those needs met: food, water, air, life. These are the things that ultimately we all need to know about. How does clean air happen? How does dirty air happen? How does climate safety happen? How do climate crises happen? What are going to be the effects? So what I'm saying is that the core curriculum, and in a sense, it's like, I'm saying it because this is the truth. The core curriculum for humans is the natural living world. All the other things that governments dictate to be the core curriculum, which fundamentally are about creating people who can take paid employment in a highly corporate world, that is like it's like yet another wraparound lie that we have been that we have been massaged into believing, because essentially nature is not a hobby. This is the life on which we depend. That is the core curriculum.
And so are these, what you're hearing from the UK, is it the same situation in Bangladesh? Are these, because you're saying in the chat, if we're all being educated in the same way, we're all going to be thinking the same way.
I mean, UK is very important here because it managed to take the education ideas throughout during the colonial period throughout the world. Still, UK education is one of the biggest selling points of UK. It's a big business, actually, especially graduate studies level, and no matter what, that is being sold. So we sitting in Bangladesh are actually studying, especially in after school, in the same way. So it's kind of like an Anglo-Saxon way of looking at the world, and it creates some kind of like a displacement within yourself, because you are living in a society but you're looking at the world through somebody else's eyes. So this is not a Bangladesh specific problem. This is a problem throughout the world, in Asia, in Caribbean, in Africa. This displacement, that we who end up working in English speaking environment, we learn to think, or at least talk or pretend in a particular way. But very fundamental question to me is, which everybody has kind of touched on, is why education? I mean, why do we need education? The education the way we know, and how long it has been there for, 100 years, 200, I don't know. I mean, is this the only way we need to be educated? There are, and what is the purpose, and why, these extinct jobs that we are being trained for? That was a great point. But also, it seems that people who need to do something or learn something are learning it from other ways. Online is a frightening place. We are picking up many unwanted education or information there. But how do we structure that, sieve that? That is all very fine. But this picking up this like 3-4-year-old children and putting through them some kind of a sausage factory and getting some product out at the end, I really question that very much. And that itself has become a big business. Last week, actually, I had 2 of my children graduate, one from undergraduate and one from high school. And the whole process, the admission process, the education, the result, how much depends on it, it just seems pointless to me at some point. And then you learn to kind of game the system, but what are you learning? So unless we kind of fundamentally challenge the purpose of why we are being educated, I don't think much can be really done through whatever system we have ended up. And it is very heavily British influenced mostly throughout the world.
Thanks very much. And you mentioned online and the importance of online. And Mya-Rose, I'd like to come to you again with the question that's in the chat about how can we develop the ideas. I mean, we talk about left and right, but actually, I'm not sure that what the subject we're talking about fits either of those really. It's across those, but without any doubt, what you raised in your provocation was that the right seems to be using the media much more effectively than those of us that really care about this area. So can you tell us how you think we need to better organize ourselves and deliver these messages more effectively?
Well, that's actually really difficult to answer because no one really knows, which is why it hasn't been done yet. And I think the thing that we forget with the internet is how new it really is, especially the state of the internet that we're currently existing with. And so I think, like I said before, very, very few options have really been explored. And I think something that would be really interesting going forward would be, in some shape or form, to I suppose combine those older, more traditional forms of protest or campaigning or activism or any of that with the online space. So I mentioned earlier Gene Sharp's book 198 Ways to Protest Nonviolently or whatever, and that was written decades ago. It was still used during the Arab Spring, things like that. It talks a lot about theatrical things, about making protest into theatre, about making it a spectacle, various things like that. And I think, again, so much of that is applicable in the online spaces. And in terms of the left-right thing, the reason I brought that up specifically is because, like I mentioned before, the right is just totally thriving in online spaces in every shape and form. You can see that in terms of I suppose people who do discourse like Ben Shapiro, who are incredibly popular. You can see that to do with like how conspiracy theories spread, how communities form, which is how you end up with things like the riot at the Capitol buildings in America, but even things as simple as how they have managed to claim various like pieces of online culture, even just memes and things like that. It just means that it's sort of this unstoppable wave to an extent. And what this is people who just totally understand the internet, I suppose manipulating it for their own goals and ideology. And meanwhile, all of my experience in leftist spaces or left spaces have all been about discourse and making sure everyone has the exact right opinions, and that everyone totally agrees about everything, and otherwise you're not allowed in this space. So it's just totally different in every way. But yeah, I think there's so many different options. I don't even know where to start, and I just totally think it's been totally undervalued, the online space.
Absolutely, and I completely agree with you. And my own experience in this I'd bring to bear is the creation of We Shall Not Be Removed, which is the UK Disability Arts Alliance, which was created in the pandemic by disabled people to really fight for the rights that we had before the pandemic and ensure that they continue after it. And it's existed entirely online because it's made up of by and large people who are clinically extremely vulnerable and cannot meet physically and cannot engage fully in the real world at the moment. And we've really broken through, in terms of the arts space, of the cultural space. So I think online can be really used effectively. But I guess, when you look at this more traditional methods of media, we've seen the launch this week in the UK of GB News, and which is clearly, is not going to be, focusing on this subject very much, I wouldn't have thought. Jay, you mentioned media as well. Could I bring you in here and get your perspectives on what can be done in terms of the media space?
Yes, I think one of the aspects is kind of that thing of, as Extinction Rebellion so brilliantly said, so boldly, is tell the truth. But it's also, telling the truth means telling the truth, telling the whole truth and nothing but the truth. And one of the things that the media could be so brilliant at is properly, creatively making the future that we are blindly and knowingly walking into, making that future appear real to us. The media it's got so many skills about telling personal stories, and I don't mean an individual telling their personal stories. I mean about choosing kind of ways by which we see a small individual story, and that can be like a kind of fractal narrative. It can be, expanded and expanded and expanded. That, the things that are still given us, as these cold facts, like sort of such and such a percentage of Bangladesh may be underwater. How many times have I read that as if there were no people doing that, as if there were no people who were going to suffer that? And it's like these are the kinds of things where, it's the skills of the media are absolutely unbelievably good, or can be, and that what is needed are people of enormous responsibility to see those things as kind of, as their role. I think the other thing is, and, I don't mean this to sound like kind of, that this is a cruel way of looking at it, but it does seem to me that it is wise for people in governments all across the world and people in the media all across the world to realize that there will be courts in the not very far future where they will be in court for having had the positions that they've had for the last 20 years and for having failed to use them. And so that is a bit of a grim note, but it's a bit of a kind of, I want to say it like it's a kind of carrot and stick. The carrot is the media has in its hands the most incredible skills to properly present the future to us now in all sorts of myriad of ways from a myriad of places around the world, and to realize that there will be court cases and they will be on the wrong side.
Thank you, Jay. I mean, I'd like to move us on to thinking about protest and the question that Richie has asked, which is, do campaigns like Black Lives Matter, Extinction Rebellion, We Should Not Be Removed, and others benefit from supporting each other, or do they lose focus by working together, and should they concentrate on their own campaign issues? Now, Sophie, you were really talking about the value and importance of collaboration, and I'd like to hear your perspective here, and then I'll go to Mya-Rose to get your perception of working in these campaigns and how they work.
Well, I mean, I think it is important to have, a focus on particular issues where there are huge challenges, and and that's why Black Lives is absolutely right that it's Black Lives Matter, not every life matters, or whatever it is, the writer kind of promoting or what have you, because there is a particular problem that needs to be addressed. However, there are lots of parallels, really. So what we're dealing with again there is the symptoms of a failed system, and what we're dealing with in terms of, I mean, if you look at what's in the news in the UK over the last couple of days, so Priti Patel saying they're deeply ashamed, she's deeply ashamed of rape conviction rates, for example. So the same way that we exploit our planet, and rape and pillage our planet, there are the same sort of value sets perhaps there, and there are probably some parallels there that those groups who are campaigning around those issues could also take in terms of parallel campaigns and parallel value system being the cause of a problem in terms of the environmental movement. So whilst I don't think you should take away from a specific focus, I think that there is definitely a value in the coming together to look at the kind of what are the root causes here, because if everyone was campaigning on the basis of the kind of root causes of this, and going back to the sort of the last point around the media, I would say that a lot of the root causes of many of these problems are around our failed sort of economic system and huge challenges in our political system in terms of short-termism and not being connected or inclusive. So those are the kind of foundational reasons, I think, why we are needing to see these protests in terms of BLM, why we have destroyed the planet, why we do have gender segregation, why we have unacceptable rates of violence against women and girls, and so on and so on. So we have to get to those root causes, and that's where I think there's a real power in a number of these different sort of sectors coming together to get to that, but also in a more positive note to perhaps find solutions collectively.
Thank you, Sophie. And Mya-Rose, do you agree? Do you think that join up is realistic? Is that being delivered? You were in St Ives last weekend, protesting against the G7. Is that degree of join up there, or are these more single issues?
I absolutely think that collaboration and joining together is so important. I think in general, intersectionality has to be at the core of everything, or I think it's genuinely impossible to create a truly sustainable movement without it. In my experience, in a very tangible way, so not online, not with emails, but at physical protests and things like that, I think there has been a lack of that to an extent. But interestingly, When I was with Extinction Rebellion last weekend in St Ives, it was not like that. And there'd been a very purposeful effort to bring in other groups, combined with, I suppose, the people power, the sheer numbers of Extinction Rebellion in Cornwall. And there are a few different groups that were involved, but one of them was Black Lives Matter. We had a few amazing activists down from London, and we did various actions with them. We were reading out a letter from various Extinction Rebellion groups in the global south at the edge of, the G7 conference, as close as they'd let us. But afterwards, these two women just cried because they said that they had never been accepted into environmental spaces. They felt that they'd never been listened to, that their voices and their narrative had never been accepted, and it was the first time they'd really felt welcomed into that space, and it was a genuinely very emotive moment for them, which I think maybe says more than anything I could actually say. But I do think as well, sort of behind the scenes, there is a lot of collaboration going on, which arguably is as important as having people actually there on the day working together, because I think the biggest thing really is behind the scenes creating this massive community of support and this massive community that's pushing for change in whatever direction that means. But yeah, I'm not really sure what's going to happen going forward, because we have lots of people talking about intersectionality at the moment, but I'm not 100% sure if that's actually going to manifest itself, because I think protesting and pushing for change is always easier with single issue topics rather than, these massive groups working together. So yeah, we'll see.
Thank you for that perspective. We're running out of time. We've only got a few minutes left, and I'd like to come back to you, Samia, in Bangladesh, particularly around this final question that's in the chat. Can we depoliticize climate change? Can that be done?
Difficult, probably not impossible, but it has already been politicized. It's actually Myra's generation who will do it, because when you have, fire on your back, you act. And that is not our generation, that's their generation. The extinction and all these are the expression of that. Bangladesh, it is state policy. Environment, climate change is very much part of the core of identity of Bangladesh right now. And there will be countries like that. There will be sections in the whole world like that. Only then some movement can happen. But the way it has been politicized in the right, this rejection of any change or new way of thinking is at the core of that politics. So same-sex marriage, women emancipation, anything that you throw at them, it's resisted. So no change will come without strong organization and protest. We managed to liberate a country against America, Pakistan, and China. Bangladesh came, against that. We know how to protest, but it will have to happen with climate. I think it will be very difficult to depoliticize it, but it has to be done.
Maya, very briefly.
Sorry, I just want to say very briefly as well, I think it's really important to remember why climate became politicized in the first place. And it was because of money, and it was because of government's relationship with people like very large fossil fuel companies. And I think it's important to remember that 100 companies and corporations around the world are causing over 70% of climate change. And so I think to truly depoliticize climate change and other environmental issues, those ties have to be cut. Lobbying power has to be removed from these massive companies. And yeah, I'm not 100% sure that that's going to happen anytime soon. So I think there has to, again, be that push of people power, people pointing out that they are aware of these relationships, to try and, I suppose, take a step away from that.
No, nobody's willing to talk about changing the economic position, questioning capitalism or things like that. Nobody's willing to do that. So we are not going to get anywhere.
We're running out of time rapidly. Thank you all very much. My thanks to our brilliant panel, to Dave Gough for his provocation. I'd also like to thank Owen Shears, Simon Coates, Lindy Cook for bringing this panel together. But from me and all of us, thank you all very much for engaging today. We hope we've answered your questions, and you've enjoyed this session. Thank you all very much. Goodbye.